My name's Lisa, and I am an occupational therapist. I have been working for about 20 years doing injury prevention and ergonomics consulting. Spent a lot of time treating injured workers in a clinic. And one of the best experiences I ever had was working in a multidisciplinary return to work program here in Austin. It's called Restore. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. But what we did is we took people who were injured at work, and it had been 6 months or more since they had been working at anything, and they had complex issues. So maybe there was a psychological overlay, like they developed depression. Maybe they were getting dependent on their medication, the pain medication. Or maybe their job was so physically intense they were having trouble translating their job skills to a new kind of job. And so that's what we did. We had a psychologist who specialized in chronic pain. We had an addictionologist who was actually a retired orthopedic surgeon who studied addictionology. And then we had PT, OT, and then other things like yoga and Pilates and things like that. So we had people all day, every day. And our job was to figure out how this person can get back to employment, either with the employer or a new employer. So we had a lot of experience with workers' comp and a lot of experience. It was my job to figure out their new occupation or how to get them back to that job. So I was really excited about the presentation that we had right before this one because it'll translate really nicely into what we'll go through today. So today, what I wanted to show you, I got 2 assessment tools that we'll use kind of as a baseline. And this will help, number one, identify the different kinds of activities at a job that would be more risky, so a higher risk. And we'll be able to translate that easily into the job demand. So you remember on the work status form where he was showing us like no standing, you can sit all day, can't twist or bend or anything like that. When you know what your job requires and how much it requires it, how much force there is, and how much the person has to lift, you can have a much better conversation with a treating physician about returning that person to work. So you know exactly how much physical requirement they do have on the job, and you also know which jobs are less physically demanding for a back or a knee or a neck. So you have a better understanding. In terms of assessment tools, there are lots, and you'll see there's limitations to each kind of tool, but we'll go through this one because I like what it teaches us. In the world of ergonomics, we're concerned a lot with accumulative trauma injuries. So we know that there's an acute injury, which is something that happens in an instant. I lifted the thing and something fell and hit my foot. That's an acute injury. A cumulative injury is I do the same thing every day and I've done it for 15 years and now all of a sudden today of all days my back's starting to hurt. I didn't do anything different. I don't know why it started to hurt, but today is the day. It's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, right? So these are wear and tear injuries that happen over a long period of time, and sometimes they're confusing because sometimes we don't know what caused it. The person doesn't even know. So the employee's like, am I crazy? Was it the thing I did this weekend? Is it my job? Is it arthritis? They come up with all kinds of things. They're trying to figure out what it is. And unfortunately, the problem is sometimes that keeps them from asking for help. So cumulative trauma injuries, a lot of ergonomic injuries are cumulative. So these are things like sprains and strains, back injuries. So maybe this day you herniated a disc in your back, but it wasn't just from this day. It was from this year and this year and this year all adding up, the repetitive lifting and twisting and things like that added up. So in terms of ergonomic risk, these are the main ones that we look for. So we look for awkward postures, and I'll talk to you about exactly what that means. And the awkward postures are not just spine, it's postures of the wrist, postures of the elbows and shoulders and knees. So every joint in the body, we look at the posture of it. We also look at how long does the person have to hold that position. We do a lot of work in office ergonomics, and so a lot of people feel like, How can you get hurt? You're just sitting there. And it's the just sitting there that's the real problem. Maintaining a position takes a toll on your body. Of course, repetition, that's pretty easy for us to correlate. How does that end up with an injury? So high levels of repetition. And then contact stress. So anytime that you're resting a part of your body on a hard surface. So if I'm resting on the edge of a desk, if I prop my elbow on something hard, those are contact stresses. We also look at exposure to vibration, so either because of a tool or because of a whole environment. Maybe you're riding in a forklift for hours and hours. We look at temperature. Cold temperatures tend to affect the body more than a warm temperature because we have blood flow that's leaving the hands and feet coming back to the core. So if the person is cold, if the environment's cold, they have less blood flow in the hands and feet. Personal things we can't control. So that would be your gender, your age, your weight, your overall health. And then environmental. So anything else in the environment, whether it's the machine or the process or anything like that. So when it comes to a neutral posture, what we really mean by that is the position of the joint that is the least stressful to the body and also has the best mechanical advantage. So let me give you an example. So everybody scooch back from the table and slump down in the chair. And then raise your right arm as high as you can. Good. Now sit up tall and do it again. Raise your arm as high as you can. Can you tell that you had a greater range of motion sitting in the best posture? It's just a simple example just to show you that the posture of the body has an impact on other things. So how far you can move, how much force you can exert, and so that's part of it. We look at the posture of each joint. So my head and neck, this is a neutral posture. My shoulder at rest is a neutral posture. My spine, so I'm not in a bad, typical posture that we think of. And then knees are nice and soft. They're not locked. Hips, so we'll go through these things and show you how to look at them at work. So if you look at one of your handouts, this is called the REBA, the Rapid Entire Body Assessment. And this is one tool that you can use to identify awkward postures. And a little bit, it will talk about force and load and things like that. It doesn't account for other things. It doesn't account for vibration and some other things that you'll see in here. But what I like about it is that we can look at the different ranges of motion and we can say how bad is it? Is it a little bit bad? Is it a lot bad? And this is how this breaks this up to help us quantify that. So we'll be referring to this. Also, there is another tool, that's the second page. It's called the Rapid Upper Limb Assessment. And so that one is made for focusing in on the upper body, so the hand and arm. So for example, maybe I observe 2 or 3 different kinds of jobs, and I'm thinking, I see a lot here that seems to be hand and wrist related. So I might use that tool to look further, to look deeper into that particular job. If I'm thinking, I just want to measure this whole job in general, then I will use the entire body assessment. So here's an example of, we call this a chicken wing. And what it is that the person, it's the worst position you can use for the shoulder. And so what happens is we raise the arm out to the side, and then anytime that we have to kind of come in or do any forces while we're in this position. So we call it a chicken wing, and it's responsible for lots of shoulder injuries. So if we know, so I know that the shoulder can do this, and the shoulder can do this, and it can also rotate. So this will help us look at each one of those and say, what's going on here? So let's go through this together. So in this picture, so the first one, which one of these do you think he's in? And we're guesstimating on the angle. If you wanted to get particular, you could, but we're just guesstimating. How far up is his shoulder? High risk. Yeah. Yep, it's because the amount of range that he is away from neutral. So if this is neutral, I've gone far away from neutral. If I just went a little bit away from neutral, I'm less concerned, but I'm far away from it. And then how about out to the side? Risk, yep. And then how about his elbow? Yeah, probably caution, yeah. It's a little bit hard to tell. It's kind of tricky, right? Because now the elbow's in kind of a weird position. We're trying to measure this, but up here in this other weird position. Great. How about this one? What position in this one? How much risk in that one? Yep, because he's looking back. So this would be optimal, right? Just head and neck, nicely balanced. And then how about this one? Is he doing any side bending? Not really, right? So we don't really see side bending, that's good. And then how about how much range does he have? This has to do with how far left to right does he have to look to see his work? It doesn't look like a very big screen, right, that he's looking at. So he probably doesn't have to go this range, right? He's probably not covering that much territory. He's probably in either optimal or caution, depending on how far he has to look. All right, and then how about this one? So looking at the spine, thinking about what we know is neutral for the spine, we know the spine can do a lot of things, right? We can flex and extend, we can side bend, and we can rotate. So we're looking at each of those individually, one thing at a time. So what about how far forward, assuming that he maintains this position, not talking about the repetition, but let's assume that he stayed here and worked at this position. Yeah, 90 would be, bent straight over. And then he's probably not quite at this angle, so he is, in the caution area here. Is he side bending any? He's pretty squared up. Yeah, his feet are a little bit not square, but he's probably not really side bending very much. And how about twisting? So does he have any rotation in his body doing this task? He doesn't.
I would say probably caution because it looked like he's taking off one stack.
Yeah, if we watched the whole job in action, we would probably see that. We would probably see the twisting and the rotation. So let's figure out, like, if he does this to this, we're maintaining a forward bend position plus rotating on top of it. So when we start to combine movements like that, that's when it gets, the risk starts to go up. So not only am I bending, I'm also twisting. It just so happens that's one of the worst things you can do for a spinal disc is bend and twist. I don't know if you guys have ever had any experiences with somebody who said something like, I was just getting a sock off the floor and my back went out, right? So I'm bending and twisting, and that was kind of enough. Not that one time, but over the back has already had some kind of, it got beat up a little bit, but now I bent and twist, and that combination injured the disc. So, so we'll see in this chart that the combination of things increases also. What do you see here in terms of his back? Is he forward bending much? Not a lot, right? What is he doing though? Side bending and rotating. Anybody hurt just kind of looking at him? This particular person actually did maintain this posture for long periods of time. He only took intermediate breaks from this position and stayed there, and always welded from this side, didn't switch it up. So it was really, really a high-risk job. But this helped us kind of quantify why and what part of it is causing the problem. What about this? What do you see here? Just thinking about the spine. Yeah, his neck isn't great, but what about his spine? The rest of his spine? A teeny bit, but he's really pretty good. right? He's working, he's squared up, he's at waist level, and this is probably the least stressful position that this person could do this job in, something at waist level. So we don't have to bend, we don't have to side bend, and we don't have to twist. So it removes those risks, those awkward postures that the person would have to work in. So he does have to look down some, and so we would measure, yep, he's got to look down some, but then we'll also look next at how often he does that. And we also then look at how much force is required in those positions. So is there force required in the shoulder and arm movement that he's doing? Is there any force required in the neck? There's no force required in the neck, so we're measuring, it's the range of motion, it's the awkward posture for the neck, but then something else, like we may have force for his hands and shoulders. So this is kind of between these two tools, you have a way to kind of visually measure each different body part, which can be really helpful. And I want to point out, right here in the lower body, these are some of the risks that we look at in the lower body. So sitting with your feet unsupported, that it adds stress to your low back. Standing on an uneven surface, because now we're creating asymmetry in the lower body and spine. Prolonged standing on a hard surface, which probably everybody has exposure to that. Foot activation, meaning do I need to operate a pedal? And then also, do you have any crouching or kneeling? So that would be another low body risk. All right, what do you see in this one? For his spine. Bending, twisting, and side bending, right? He's a little bit of everything. And he does work in this position for a prolonged period of time. What could you possibly do to make that better? Yeah, yep. You can eliminate that risk by doing that. Now, if this guy, let's think about the presentation we had earlier. This guy goes to the doctor and he's hurt his back and he goes to the doctor and he's describing his job. Overall, this is a very heavy job, right? It's not necessarily heavy lifting, but it's prolonged positioning in an awkward posture, right? So if the doctor says, I don't want this guy doing any bending or twisting, then you know his ability to do this task is probably affected. And then this is almost 90 degrees, right? That's an almost 90-degree bend that he ends up getting into. And so sometimes it's a matter of how does the person work, right? It may be an individualized behavior or habit that the person has that is keeping them from being able to work in a better posture. So you can watch those things and think about ways to reduce that posture. So this one here, let's look at his shoulders. How much forward flexion is there? And if you want to look at your the rula, the upper limb, just look at the first one. Yeah, yep. So coming to the front, that's about what it looks like. All right, and then how about coming out to the side? Comes out to the side a little bit. That one's really not on here. And then how about his neck and spine? So if we go over to B. So on B, if you look at, so this is step 9, if the neck is twisted, then you add a point, and if the neck is side bending, you add a point. So his neck luckily is in a pretty straight position, but if he had to work and maybe he's twisting his neck repeatedly or he's holding in that position, then we would add that extra point. This is one way to kind of classify jobs, and you'll see that there is kind of an overall interpretation in the scoring down here. So we're just right now talking about postures, starting to talk a little bit about repetition. But just so you know, that's kind of how all of this comes together. So let's look at number one again, just for the sake of looking at this a little bit more. So let's say he's in the 20 degree, right? So we would say that that is +2 in terms of how to score on this, right? So we're looking at the risk for the shoulder. So he's in the +2. So I know he's at least got 2. And then what about if the shoulder is raised? What this means is like this. Do I have to do this plus this? He doesn't have to, right? If that was heavier, he may. As it gets heavier, you recruit more parts of your body to do the thing. But right now, he's not really raised. So I don't think we have to give him another point for that. And then if the upper arm is abducted. So abducted means to take away. So that's this position, the arm coming away from the body. So does he have a little bit of that going on? Yeah, a little bit. So he'd get a +1 for that. And then if the arm is supported or the person is leaning, meaning something like this. My arm is supported doing the activity. It's in an awkward posture, but it's being supported by the thing. Then you would take a point away. So this is a -1 here. So his overall score would be 2 plus the abduction. So he would get a 3 in this category.
Can I ask a question? So supporting limbs, even though they're in the awkward position, that's better than having them just in the awkward position?
In some cases, yes.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Very independent. So
yeah.
Just makes me think. So it's probably better to then put your elbows on the table while you're eating.
Absolutely.
Okay. Take that one home.
Yeah. So in office ergonomics, what we teach people is if your shoulders are just relaxed and you bend your elbows about 90 degrees, that's about where your keyboard should be. And none of us work here. What happens most of the time is that the desk surface is too high, so we elevate our shoulders and come forward, and we have to lean because we can't maintain this posture. It's too hard, so we lean. And it's not that, and so that is better than doing this. The resting is better than holding your arms up in space. But in the whole picture, we got to figure out how to get in the ideal position. And of course, office ergonomics are much easier to control. But that's an example of kind of how you take the pieces and parts, the information, and put a picture together. So, all right. Now let's look at his elbows. So he's got some bend in his elbows, so we're moving on to step 2. He's kind of in a +2 range, right? So his elbows are bent, he's right at 90. By the time he picks this thing up, he's gonna have this angle. So 90 degrees would be kind of the easiest working angle. If I'm lifting something here, it's probably harder than lifting something in this position, right? And if I bend my elbow even more, that's hard on the joint itself. It's being bent too long. So that's the reasoning behind what they're saying to us here.
How is the weight of the object calculated in this as well? Is that not taken into account, or is it another calculation?
This one doesn't take into account very much about the weight of the thing. And at the end of the presentation, I'll show you a list of tools that you use to measure different problems. So there is usually no one tool fits all unless somebody, a consultant, has put together their own proprietary, like, this is how I measure everything. So I'll measure posture, force, repetition, and all the other, vibration, temperature, and all that as well. So unfortunately, what normally we do is we say, think this job right here, do a basic observation of the job. We talk to the person and we say, what's hard about your job? What do you think is the most difficult? Interview the person. And then we're starting to think about, what about that job do I want to measure? What do I want to go in and look at deeper? And which tool do I need to use to do that? Do I want to look mostly at the awkward postures? These would be great. But if I want to look at lifting, or if even I'm looking at how do I want to figure out where I need to have people, I want to redesign something, there's a different tool for that. So I'll give you a list of those at the end. But yeah, it's a little frustrating because it doesn't account for everything.
No, I understand.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so he's +2 on his elbows. Does he have to do any of this? Any rotation? Not really, right? So he'll probably get a 2 there. And then it says, number 2, if either arm is working across midline, so the midline of your body, if he had to maybe move, or if he's working like this, that's working with this arm crossing midline, which is harder on the body. So they would give you more points for that. And points aren't good in this case. All right, so it moves through the different body parts. And in step 7, well, let's look up step 6. If posture is mainly static, meaning held for more than 10 minutes, or if the action repeated occurs 4 times per minute, then add 1. So if he's having to lift this, now we're looking a little bit at some frequency, and so we can add more risk. That's what we're doing, right? We're adding another risk another point for risk. Then in number 7, it said if the load's less than 4.4 pounds, that's easy. We don't have to do anything about that. If it's 4.4 to 22 pounds, add a point. And then if the load is 4.4 and it's a static or repeated load, so we're doing it more frequently, then you add 2 points. And if it's more than 22 pounds, add 3. So now if your jobs are, if you're thinking 22 pounds is nothing, is not the right tool. There's a different tool. So this one is going to measure jobs up to about that force or that load. But it would be helpful for if you were getting a lot of shoulder injuries. It would be helpful for that because you can look and see what happens to the shoulder. How do I look at the position of the shoulder and figure out what's going on? How can I sort through this to see? When it comes to the hands, things that are very small are harder to hold on to. So when we're using a pincher grip that's really small like this, and holding that for a long period of time, that's hard for the hand. It's easier to hold something a little bit bigger. That's one of the reasons people have pens and pencils that are a little bit built up. So a thicker one is easier to hang on to. So sometimes we look at, can we add anything to a tool to take away some of the risk, right? This would be a great example of that. Can I add a handle that is a little bit bigger so that this person doesn't have to do quite such a range of motion? So this is a resting position for my hand, and I'm having to leave it and come all the way in here to do that activity. So for the hand itself, that's a lot of deviation from resting. And if I can come instead in here, that's easier. It's an improvement. It's a little bit less risk. You've probably seen recommendations like this, right, in modifying handles. And the whole reason, if you look at number 3 here, we're trying to keep the wrist in a neutral position so that we can measure how much, what's happening here at the hand. Yep, wrist deviation. So his hand is going like this. It's going away from the center. And in this one, that doesn't happen, right? So when it comes to repetitive work, we're looking at repetition, so the number of times it's happening, or how long is the cycle? Does the cycle continue over and over and over again? So this is a 2-minute cycle and it happens all the time. So we're thinking about that when we're looking at repetition. And here's one way to quantify repetition. So do I have a cycle time greater than 30 seconds? Meaning that the whole cycle itself is a mixture of so many physical activities over a period of 30 seconds, because that's less risky. Or is less than half of the cycle time performing the same fundamental skill. So that means I have a variety of activities. I'm not just repeating the same movement throughout that whole cycle. Does that make sense? And then high repetition will be the opposite, so less than 30 seconds or more than half the activity is doing that same physical motion. So postural changes, so this kind of was part of our demonstration, postural changes change force as well. So if I'm sitting, that's one amount of pressure on the disc in my low back. As I'm doing different activities, the pressure in the disc starts to increase. So I'm combining two things. I'm sitting, but plus some forward bending. So the position of our body, so if you have someone, that's where kind of the idea of proper lifting comes from. If you have someone lifting in a bad posture, it is harder on the body than if that same person lifted with a good posture, neutral, making the joints neutral because they are the strongest in that position, right? So if you go to carry a box and you hold it close to your body, that's one amount of force. And then obviously, the further away from your body, the more force is translated to your back, right? So doing things in good postures and in good positions can be part of the activity itself. It could also be just the person not using a good posture, not knowing what to do. So this is demonstrating that. So how much of a load, so if it weighs, if something is weighing 20 kilograms right here close to your body, and then as your shoulder height is increasing, how much weight is really being I'm sorry, this is different kinds of weight that you could tolerate at different heights. So lower weight tolerated if you need to lift it from the floor, knee level, waist level, chest level, or above chest level. I think that's common sense. I think everybody knows that. But that's an example of how the posture and the force go together. And then this slide shows you what happens when you combine posture and force, force and repetition. So if I have low force and low repetition, not too concerned. But if I have high force and high repetition, I've exponentially increased, right, the exposure for that particular activity. These are just, there are some guidelines that you can look at that will talk about different heights, ideal working heights for activities. And then you can calculate, you can figure out, is the person having to do heavy work in that job? Is it precision work? Because I might need it a little bit higher than if I'm doing heavier work or super heavy work. So I don't want to work down here doing precision work because I need to see it and I need to use my hands. So I would have to come all the way down. Right? But if I'm lifting something heavy or working with something heavy, I may need it at a lower position. So these are some examples of contact stress. So forearms resting on the edge of the work surface, a pressure from a tool handle. So if a tool handle ends in your palm, that puts a lot of pressure right here at the carpal tunnel. If the tool extends past your palm, then it reduces that pressure. So it's not contact stress going directly over the carpal tunnel. And then kneeling on the floor during a maintenance operation is another source of contact stress. So for contact stress, what can we possibly do about those situations? We could pad the area. We could see if it's necessary. It may not be necessary to have that impact, right? Why is contact stress so bad? Yes, so in some parts of the body, the nerves are very close to the surface. And so especially in my elbow, it's very bony. There's no padding or protection. When I hit my funny bone, I'm hitting the nerve because there isn't any protection there. So also if I rest on that part of my elbow, I'm compressing the nerve throughout the day. I can do the same thing here at the wrist. So not only at the carpal tunnel, but there's another nerve that lives close by, and that one can get compressed as well. So compressing nerves or restricting blood flow are the biggest problems with contact stress. Now, if you have part of your body resting, if I'm resting on this part of my forearm, I'm less concerned about it because this is muscle and it can take more compression. But if it was the bony part where nerves can get compressed, then I'm going to be concerned about that. So here's an example of things you can do to reduce contact stress. This one also improves her posture, right? So that's kind of a twofer. That was a good one. All right, here's a list of some of the assessment tools. So we've got the two that I handed you today. So one that's entire body and then one that's more focused on upper body. There's another one called the Rogers Fatigue, which combines posture and effort. If you want to look more at lifting, you can, and also contributions for design, you can look at these two. And these are all available. These are not things that you have to pay for. So you can use them. And then general medical, this physical demand category is going to be really important for understanding what a person can do if they're injured, if they have work restrictions, and also for quantifying your job. So what does it take to do this job physically? And you'll probably see how if we take this information, it will really nicely correlate with that duty status form. So if we're able to take our jobs and identify physically what's required to do them, then I have that functional job description. I've done a physical demands analysis, and that job description can go to the doctor to say this is what the job takes. This is what it takes. When the last person was talking, I just kind of wanted to. I was like, this is so important because in our experience, we had so many people that would go to the doctor and they would get those kinds of duty status forms, like you're off work or you can't do anything, so the poor employer is like, what am I supposed to do? And based on a lot of people that we saw, it's super stressful for the employee too, right? To be injured, to be off work, to be going to treatment. It can be very confusing and irritating and stressful for them to deal with workers' comp too. And so without the communication, without somebody kind of guiding the person through the process, they often start to feel a little bit lost, a little bit uncared for, and then resentment starts building and all kinds of misunderstandings happen. And I completely support what he was saying about attorneys. A lot of times people think, I haven't got my check yet, I'm gonna go get an attorney. They're ready to go. And unfortunately, that money is just going to the attorney and not to that person. So there's so much, it's so hard for some people to navigate the system, and then they start getting angry. So the good ones are getting angry and hurt and all kinds of things. And so it can really turn things into a really bad situation. This can help. So if you can analyze these different basic activities, then you have a physical job description you can give to the doctor that's objective. And it's not just what the employee is saying that their job requires. It's what really happens. So this is a functional job demand worksheet. These are the things that it measures. These are parts of the lifting, pushing, and pulling. So a lot of these are just postures and positions. These numbers, I'll show you in a second, stand for continuous, frequently, occasionally, or none. And those things are also part of the duty status. So this is all medical speak, right? Doctors understand this, therapists understand this. And so knowing how to kind of talk that language could be very helpful. So here, when we look at the job, knowing whatever tool we used or our observation, we can start to quantify what is it? So do I do this thing? Do I have to kneel? So let's say I have a person with a knee injury, and I know that this job requires them to kneel occasionally, right? So occasionally would mean up to 33% of the workday they're kneeling. So when they go to the doctor, that's pretty significant. So it's probably legitimate that that person probably should not kneel, and their rehab goals should be to be able to do this, right? So that should be part of what the therapists are helping them get to is, I need you to tolerate this thing, so that's gonna take X amount of treatment plan. So that's your frequency right here. And then we're also kind of quantifying where do you have to lift? Lifting at shoulder height and above, very, very hard for the shoulder and neck. But lifting at waist level might be a completely different story. So if you have somebody that says, oh yeah, I've got to put boxes on a shelf overhead all day, doc, I can't possibly go back to work. And you talk to the person and you say, you don't have to put them up there. You can put it here instead. Now, how does that change what the doctor says that the person can do? Because this is a much easier task than overhead. Sometimes restrictions are really just range of motion, right, depending on the injury. It's really just the range that the person can't tolerate. So this would help. All right, so then the next part here, this is just right down here. Now we start to look at the weight. Overall, what is the heaviest thing that the person would have to lift? And we're thinking about, okay, ever so often, for example, we saw a lot of people that work for like FedEx and places like that. So I know that they require 75-pound lift to do the job. So my rehab goal is 75-pound lift. In reality, what I know is, and that's occasional. I know that on a frequent basis, they're lifting around in this range, and then on a constant basis, this range. So what you do with this is you figure out the heaviest thing that the person has to lift, and we're testing to see if the person can lift that amount. When the person can lift that amount occasionally, then we know that these things should be tolerable. So that gives the employer a range of what I think they can do. But if I know that this person is nowhere close to this and they're here, now I need to look for a light level job for the person. So these are pretty standard descriptions of jobs. And this is kind of one of the main things that they correlate to, is how heavy is the heaviest lift. So if you're trying to get someone back to work. This also helps you just quantify the job itself. This is a heavy job, this is a light job. Now if I have someone injured, I know where to start looking. I know what job types I can start looking at to put them back at. So this is a summary of the upper body risk reduction. So try not to do pinch gripping real forcefully. So opening up that pinch or avoiding anything where you have to use just the fingers. If you can use the whole hand, it's better. There's more force. So avoiding that. Avoid forceful exertions over shoulder height. Lifting something heavy, or if you're working overhead and you're using force to push or pull, that is hard. It's especially hard on the shoulder. Avoid the chicken wing. We see this a lot with like packing and things like that. Minimize hammering. So hammering is an impactful force, not only for the whole body, but wherever the handle is hitting in the hand itself. You can't really avoid doing that for certain jobs, but you can minimize it. Slight bend of the elbow when carrying, so try not to be in a position, try not to get the load so heavy that the person has to lock their elbows. Minimizing forceful rotations and torque. So that is added risk, right? Obviously keeping things close so they don't have to reach. Some of this is really more like job coaching or some kind of just employee behavior training. So making sure that they're moving things to the front of a shelf before they lift them. So the heavier something is, if you have something that is in the very back and you slide it forward first and then lift it, that's easier than trying to go in and lift from the back. So trying to avoid stock on the floor. So what do you think would be physically in the body, thinking about awkward posture, what's the difference between keeping things down low and having them more at mid-range, at waist height? So we have the back gets out, it gets an extreme range of motion. What about the shoulders? Even the shoulders would have to, right? Because this is essentially what they would end up doing. Neck, sometimes your neck extends when you're lifting something heavy. You naturally kind of pull your head back. So you may see that one simple activity can actually have a negative impact on the posture of a lot of different body parts. So on this, Pushing is easier than pulling, so when you have a choice, definitely try pushing. And then, of course, making sure all the equipment stays in good shape, making sure that it doesn't take extra to push and pull, especially like initiating the load.
Isn't that every shopping cart in a grocery store?
Yeah, yeah. And it's one of the reasons it's so irritating, right? Not only is it wobbling, it's a little harder to push. Yeah. Yep. So that's a summary. I want to see if you guys have questions about these two things. So it gets, when you're trying to actually do the scoring, it can get really weird. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. All right.
That good.
Any questions or anything?
Just had a quick question. Is there any data that supports we will have more ergonomic injuries during the first month of work due to like work hardening for, somebody that's fresh out of high school, never had a job, and
Yep.
all of a sudden they're put on a manufacturing floor. Because I know a lot of times that's when
Yeah.
bar injuries would occur.
Yes.
In the first month of work.
Yeah.
Due to work hardening.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Definitely that is a bigger risk factor in terms of like data that I can just spout out. I don't have that, but it is definitely a known thing that when you're new to the job, you're doing a new job, you are more at risk for an injury because your body's not efficient at it and it's not trained. So we all learn efficiencies, right, as we're doing things. So it's the physical getting used to it plus the efficiency piece of the body just kind of naturally finding new ways to do it. Yep. Great. Any other questions? All right. Thank you guys very much.